Willow Mercer hadn't expected much when she first stepped onto the overgrown gravel path that led to the neglected plot outside of Pinefield. The air here was different. Thicker, slower, free from the suffocating buzz of the suburban efficiency she had fled. Her late husband, a quiet man who had worked maintenance for the regional rail, had bought the land long ago, a parcel that sat just outside of any incorporated jurisdiction. He had intended to build a greenhouse here one day, though he never got around to more than planting a few berry bushes and burying a rusted garden bench in the tall grass. When he died, the place had been forgotten for a while. The grass kept growing, the mailbox leaned further every season, and no one came asking what she planned to do with it. That's exactly why Willow came back. After nearly 2 decades of city life, of committee meetings and architectural clients with too much money and no taste, Willow had burned out in a way that couldn't be fixed with a sabbatical or a therapist. Her career as a design consultant had spiraled quietly into something she resented. Sterile projects, corporate renovations, buildings with no soul. What once was a passion had become paperwork, and worse, compromise. So, when she found herself in an ER with chest pains that turned out to be stress-related, she took the hint. She left her apartment, turned her phone off, and took the deed out of her fireproof box. The land in Pinefield wasn't much to look at on paper. 32 acres of field, scrub oak, and a dilapidated shed, bordered on one side by a seasonal creek and on the other by a crumbling fence that separated her from the edge of a slowly encroaching housing development. But to Willow, it looked like the first clear breath she'd had in years. She bought a second-hand trailer, hired a man named Len from the gas station to help her clear brush, and began stacking hay bales along the western edge, building out a terraced line to protect the slope from erosion. At first, it was just practical. The rain carved shallow troughs into the soil, and the hay helped hold the line. But then, instinct kicked in. The same instinct that once made her rearrange lobby furniture by intuition, that let her feel spatial balance without rulers. She began shaping the hay differently, stacking them not just for support, but for effect. At a glance, her field looked like a minimalist sculpture garden. Square forms in natural hues, aligned with the arc of the sun, following the slope as if grown there. She didn't call it art, didn't call it anything, but it felt right. She worked mostly in silence. Pinefield didn't have a lot of foot traffic, and the few houses nearby were spread thin. She met some of her neighbors in passing, mostly retirees, quiet types who nodded politely and kept to themselves. No one said much about what she was doing, and she liked it that way. The mail came sporadically. There were no trash collection services, and the nearest Wi-Fi signal was 3 miles down the road. She adapted. She learned to use the post office again, rediscovered printed books, and found peace in the heavy physicality of her labor. She chopped wood, layered straw, trimmed her own trees, and fell asleep with her hands stained from the earth. The quiet broke eventually. Not with a confrontation, but with a smile. The kind that came too wide, too fast, and didn't quite reach the eyes. It was attached to a woman named Karen Lander, who arrived at Willow's trailer one morning under the pretense of checking in on things. She wore a pastel windbreaker and held a clipboard, despite having no official badge. She introduced herself as Community Liaison for the Visual Standard Board, a title that didn't sound real but was said with enough conviction to give it shape. Willow offered her coffee, which Karen declined with a gracious but thin-lipped smile. "You've done quite a bit of work," Karen said, scanning the field. "It's rustic, aesthetic in its own way, but it does stand out." Willow knew what that meant, even if Karen didn't say it outright. She had lived through enough neighborhood associations to know how these things began. She kept her voice even. "It's hay. It keeps the ground in place." Karen tilted her head as if puzzled. "Of course, though some of the residents have expressed concern. It's quite visible from the ridge, and from the park trail behind Lot 17. You know, this area has a certain look, a tone we've been trying to preserve." There was no we, Willow thought. Just people like Karen who felt entitled to edit other people's spaces. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, thanked Karen for stopping by, and let her leave. But 2 days later, there was a notice in her mailbox. A printed form with her name handwritten at the top, and a box checked next to non-conforming material use. No logo, no contact info, just a statement that her property had been observed in violation of community visual harmony guidelines. She almost laughed. There was no HOA here, not officially. She had made sure of it when she bought the place. The nearest neighborhood jurisdiction ended a mile up the road. She asked around and learned that Karen had formed something informal, a visual coordination group, just a few months prior, not with any legal authority, but by collecting signatures from bored retirees and worried new homeowners who didn't want to rock the boat. It wasn't binding, but that didn't mean it couldn't become oppressive. Willow had seen that before, too. She let it sit. The paper, the comment, the smile. She stacked more hay, then rearranged some of it into a curved formation that faced the road, an arched wall, 12 feet high, that cast a soft shadow over a posted wooden sign Karen had hammered into the ditch. Proposed observation point. Willow added her own sign, natural installation, entering subject to altered perspective. The next day, the sign was gone. The ditch was empty. The day after that, there was a new one. Larger this time, bolted into a post sunk 3 feet deep and cemented with decorative stone. It was sleek, printed in all caps sans serif letters. Civic, Visual Standard Area, Compliance under Review. That was when Willow knew it wasn't going to stop. Not with polite conversation, not with ignoring them. She wasn't going to play their game by their terms. But she wasn't going to be silent either. And if they wanted to talk about harmony, she would show them what it looked like when the land itself decided to speak. The wind had picked up the next morning, dragging a low gray haze across the horizon and scattering the top layer of hay from Willow's eastern line. She was out early, raking it back into place when she saw the car. Not one she recognized. Not local. It was a compact black crossover with dealer plates and a thin layer of road dust coating its sides, the kind of car that didn't belong on the unpaved cutoff road that wound its way to her field. It slowed without stopping and pulled into the edge of her turn-in, the tires crackling over gravel. 2 women stepped out, one in heeled boots and a quilted vest that was far too clean for the terrain, the other holding what looked like a mounted laser level. Willow didn't move. She stood by the haystack, rake in hand, watching them as they angled the instrument across the crest of the slope, pointing it directly toward her installation. They said nothing to her, didn't even wave. They simply walked, pointed, made notes, then turned back to the car and drove off as quietly as they came. That afternoon she found another note. This one was laminated. It was zip-tied to the rusted cattle fence that marked the edge of her property. Not quite trespassing, but close enough to feel like a challenge. The language was oddly precise. You are hereby notified that continued obstruction of designated visual corridors may result in enforcement action pursuant to neighborhood standards. Again, no letterhead, no agency listed. Just a phone number. Willow called it. A woman answered with a clipped, professional tone, simply saying, "Visual Standards Review Desk." When Willow asked who had jurisdiction over her property, the woman hesitated for just a breath, then responded, "All parcels within observational radius are subject to consideration." That was new and meaningless. Willow didn't reply. She hung up, poured herself a coffee, and took a slow walk around the perimeter of her field. She thought of the way Karen had smiled during their first conversation, the softness of it, the practiced warmth that made it feel like a trap. This wasn't about one woman being picky. This was the slow tightening of some invisible thread, a pseudo-system creeping over the boundary lines, defining things that had never needed defining. Willow had lived through enough of these battles to recognize the shape of them before the first strike. The worst thing you could do was react emotionally. They were counting on that. She took photographs of her own installations, of the property lines, of the new sign, of the women with the level. She recorded the date and time, then drove to the county planning office where she waited for 2 hours to speak to someone about non-standard jurisdictional activity. The clerk on duty, a man in his 50s with a carefully neutral expression, explained that unless her land was within an incorporated district or under specific easement, no one had the authority to enforce visual standards. If it's private property and you're not violating zoning, there's no legal structure that can enforce aesthetics, unless you're part of an HOA. She told him she wasn't. He nodded and added, "Unofficial groups can make noise, but they can't legislate." That same night, her power went out. It wasn't a storm. There were no lines down. She checked the breaker. No issues. Her trailer was still warm from the daytime sun, so she waited, assuming it was a grid fault. But the outage didn't affect anyone else. The neighbor, 2 parcels down, still had lights. The street lamp by the old road still flickered as usual. She called the power company, and after being bounced between departments, someone finally told her meter had been flagged for inspection. No one had come to inform her. She asked what kind of inspection. They didn't say. "Contact your community standards office," the representative offered blandly. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, a new post had been installed near the edge of her field, directly in line with her main installation. It had a metal plate on top, flat and reflective, like a makeshift survey marker. Below it was another note: "Scheduled alignment in progress." Nothing more. Willow called Rita Mendes. The woman came recommended by the clerk at the planning office, an administrative attorney with a reputation for excelling at quiet fights. When Willow explained what was happening, Rita didn't react with surprise. Instead, she asked 3 specific questions. Did the land have existing utility easements? Had she received formal code violations from a recognized municipal entity? And had she ever signed a visual access consent form, even unknowingly? The answer to all 3 was no. "Good," Rita said. "Then they're bluffing. And bluffing means they're nervous." Rita sent formal inquiries to the power company, to the planning board, to the county records department. She dug up every document related to Willow's land, scanned the recorded boundaries, and checked for backdoor easements that might have been inherited through older parcels. There were none. What she did find, though, was a notation in an old zoning draft, an unofficial comment attached to a community development proposal from 8 years ago. It read, "Eastern Crest has high-value sightline. Potential corridor for future passive park expansion. Recommend keeping open." It wasn't law. It wasn't even approved. But someone had remembered it. The more Willow looked, the more she saw how many small, quiet adjustments were being made around her. The field behind Lot 22, previously wild and full of scrub brush, had been cleared. Not developed, just stripped down. Another neighbor had recently removed their backyard fence after a conversation with Karen. The path leading toward the creek had a new sign: "Future Greenway. Access point in review." There were no dates, no permits, just intentions, posted like facts. And then came the drone. It was small, black, and loud. It hovered at a fixed height, passed twice over her field, then returned down the road. Willow didn't chase it. She didn't throw rocks. She simply made note of the trajectory and called Rita again. Rita arrived in person that time. She walked the property with a notepad, taking photos and measurements, not saying much until they sat on the trailer steps with coffee. "You're not paranoid," she finally said. "Someone's trying to assert a soft claim over this space, not legally but perceptually. If they can convince enough people that your land is a part of their design, They'll have leverage next time funding or zoning changes are up for vote. So they build around me until I look like the problem, Willow said. Rita nodded. Exactly. They didn't talk for a few minutes. The wind shifted. The hay wall creaked slightly in the afternoon sun. Do I take it down? Willow asked. Rita looked at her like the question was offensive. Absolutely not. You double it. You stabilize it. And you document every inch of it. That night, Willow worked in the dark, stacking hay with her headlamp on, laying stone along the base to anchor the curves. Not as a protest. Not out of spite. But as an act of grounded presence. The most powerful resistance to fiction was fact. She drove stakes deeper, etched lines into the soil to mark her physical domain, and posted a new sign in the center of the arch. It read, Land remembers what papers forget. And the next morning, it was still standing. But now, so was something else. A clipboard nailed to a stake just beyond her fence. Notice of Advisory Committee Field Evaluation, pending status review. Beneath that, a checklist. One box was already marked. Visual disruption. Confirmed. The first official appearance of the clipboard men happened on a Tuesday morning, just after the dew had lifted and the heat started to rise. Willow heard them before she saw them. Muffled male voices and the rhythmic metallic clink of something being unfolded and set on the ground. By the time she reached the edge of her western slope, there were already 4 of them scattered across the ditch line, 2 in matching khaki windbreakers with hard cases beside their feet, 1 younger man with a drone controller slung over his shoulder, and an older, heavier-set man adjusting the legs of a high-mounted lens tripod. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who had been given either permission or instructions, and from the way they ignored her approach, she assumed they thought they didn't need either. She didn't speak immediately. She let them continue for another minute. Watched as the lens clicked into position and the drone man launched his quadcopter into a slow arc above the hay wall. Only when the drone began to pivot back, hovering lower than it should have, did she step forward and speak. This is private land, she said, her voice even, not raised but firm. Unless you're from the county or have a warrant, I suggest you take your toys and go film your own backyards. The older man with the tripod turned first. His demeanor was entirely performative, mildly amused as though she were interrupting a garden tour rather than confronting a trespass. Good morning, he said. We're here on behalf of the Visual Compliance Advisory Review Board. This area has been flagged for alignment inconsistency. That's not a real board, Willow replied, and this is not your jurisdiction. One of the khaki-clad techs, younger, with a shaved head and a clipboard tucked under his arm, stepped forward and added, Ma'am, the board was approved by 72% of local residents in a non-binding advisory vote. We're conducting a Phase 1 terrain and sightline scan. No permanent installations, no soil disturbance, just compliance data collection. She almost laughed at the phrase, non-binding advisory vote. That was the whole game right there. A fiction given weight by repetition. Soft consensus replacing legality. She didn't argue. Instead, she took out her phone and snapped a clear photo of each of their faces, one by one, not smiling, not blinking. You've been documented trespassing on parcel C-17A, she said, and this will be forwarded to both my attorney and the sheriff's office. The older man finally broke character. His eyes narrowed just for a moment, and his voice dropped the rehearsed calm. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, Willow said. You are. They packed up, slowly, deliberately, not rushing. But the drone landed, the tripod came down, and within 15 minutes they were gone, back up the gravel drive in a dust cloud that clung to her boots long after the car disappeared. That evening, she walked the perimeter of the property again. There were small orange survey flags stuck into the earth near her north-facing line, 3 of them spaced evenly just inside her fence. She pulled each one up and set them neatly on her porch. When she returned to the field the next morning, they were back in the ground. Same spots, same angle. She called Rita. By now, Rita was no longer surprised. Her voice carried a clipped energy, the kind that said she'd had this kind of case before, or one close enough. "They're creating evidence," she said. "They want a pattern of passive acknowledgement, hoping you'll let it stand long enough for someone to claim de facto agreement. Don't touch the flags again. Don't engage. Just document, timestamp, and log everything." Willow did as she was told. She set up her own trail cameras, low profile, camouflaged, facing the perimeter. She planted steel fence posts deeper into the soil, each one within her property line, and attached laminated boundary signs to each one with thick gauge wire. She poured gravel under the entrance gate, enough to catch fresh tire tracks, and she stopped turning off her porch light at night. 2 days passed. Then came the trucks. Not construction vehicles. No, not yet. These were community service-branded SUVs, marked with a logo she'd never seen before, a blue-green arc with the word VeriSite under it in elegant, non-threatening font. The men who stepped out wore high-visibility vests and carried clipboards with printouts that looked suspiciously like Google Maps satellite overlays. They didn't cross onto her land, but they walked the road's shoulder, pointing at elevation lines, scribbling, measuring shadows. She watched them from the porch, arms crossed, saying nothing. One of them noticed her and waved, too casually. She didn't wave back. Later that week, the signpost on the main road changed again. The familiar metal square was gone, replaced now by a full-panel plexiglass board bolted into a cedar frame. It had color-coded maps, photos, and text, Proposed Scenic Corridor Restoration Initiative. In the lower right corner, under the smallest font, a list of target parcels included hers, in faded gray. The implication was clear. They weren't just suggesting she conformed. They were presenting her absence of compliance as obstruction. Rita filed a cease and desist letter, naming each action: aerial surveillance, unauthorized land access, unfiled mapping attempts, unsanctioned signage. It was sent to the county, to the so-called advisory board, and to Karen directly. The response came in the form of a handwritten envelope left on Willow's gate. No return address, no salutation, just a single page of the printer paper that read, "We all live here. You're not exempt from context." It was the first moment Willow felt it shift from irritation to threat. That weekend, someone tossed a bundle of dry twigs over her fence. They landed near the hay wall, laced together with twine. Not enough to burn, not enough to prove anything. But the message was there. The following morning, her water tank's filter had been unscrewed. Not broken, just loosened, enough for the pressure to drop and the faucets to cough and sputter. She checked the trail cams. 2 had been knocked out of alignment. A third had been stolen outright. Willow didn't panic. She made no statements. She simply got in her truck and drove straight to the sheriff's office, where she filed a formal incident report for suspected tampering, trespass, and harassment. She provided photos, timestamps, and names. The deputy behind the desk, an older man with a scar under one eye and hands that looked too large for the keyboard, nodded as he took her statement, then muttered, "You're not the first. You won't be the last." That night, she replaced the cameras, wired them directly to a backup drive inside the trailer, replaced the floodlight with a motion-activated system, and rigged a tripwire along the lower edge of her hay wall. Not a trap, just a noise trigger, enough to startle. When she returned inside, she paused at her kitchen table and looked out the window. The wall stood tall under the moonlight, casting a deep shadow across the slope. Beyond it, just past the edge of the road, was the faintest flicker of movement. A shape slipping behind one of the road signs. She didn't move. She just watched and waited. They weren't going to stop, so neither would she. The letter from the county came folded twice, thick with inserts and printed on textured paper with a faint watermark that read, Regional Environmental Coordination Program. It was the kind of envelope Willow normally associated with tax, reassessments, or rural infrastructure notices. Official, dry, uninterested in conflict. But this time, the language inside was dense with suggestion. She read it twice, then a third time, and only by the fourth did she start to understand the strategy. It wasn't a summons or a warning. It was a proposal of observation cooperation. A 6-page request for voluntary participation in an ongoing regional visibility initiative. No one accused her of anything. No one mandated compliance. But the terms were clear. By declining to participate, she was confirming her position as a non-aligned parcel, subject to future independent review. There were no legal repercussions listed, just consequences framed as inevitabilities. Assessment, public commentary, eventual formal attention. It was theater performed with paper, but Willow recognized the rehearsal. This wasn't enforcement. It was enclosure. And it had just stepped one layer closer. Rita read the document and frowned in a way Willow hadn't seen before. Not confused, but irritated. They're trying to draw you into the structure. If you acknowledge the framework, you enter the game on their board. That's the trap. You're not in it. Stay that way. She flipped through the remaining pages and sighed. This entire program was created under a temporary grant meant for wetland restoration. They've repurposed it for visual compliance under the language of landscape integrity. It's technically legal. It's also bureaucratic fantasy. Willow asked if they could fight it. Rita nodded, but without the usual fire. Not directly. The fight doesn't happen in court, not yet. It happens in perception. They're trying to claim your image before they claim your land. That was the moment it became entirely clear. This wasn't about hay bales. It wasn't about zoning or safety or neighborhood views. It was about narrative, the story being built foot by foot in signs and flyers and false committees. They weren't coming with bulldozers. They were coming with diagrams and color-coded proposals, with abstract ideals and curated language. And they were betting that Willow wouldn't hold the line long enough to matter. She decided to shift tactics. If they were building stories, she would build one stronger. That same week, she submitted an application to the local preservation committee, a small, underfunded office located in a modular trailer behind the historic town museum. Her application was for recognition of agricultural art installation, a rarely used classification meant to protect cultural displays with traditional significance. She attached images of her hay wall, explained the erosion control function, described the rural heritage context, and framed the entire construction as both landscape management and environmental reflection. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it didn't need to be. It just had to be a start. The clerk who accepted the application looked at her as though surprised she wasn't asking about grave markers or old cabins. But he didn't argue. He stamped it, logged it, and told her the board reviewed new entries quarterly. "Might take a while," he added. Willow nodded. That was fine. She had time. The night after filing, she walked the perimeter again, flashlight in one hand, a piece of rebar in the other. The trail cams had recorded 2 people the previous night. No faces, no identifying marks, just figures in dark clothes scanning the edge of her field. They hadn't touched anything. Not yet. But they had circled, lingered, turned their heads toward the trailer as if confirming a location. It wasn't damage they were after. It was pressure. So she pressed back. She added height to the wall. Not uniformly, but in sculpted ridges that angled away from the road, giving the structure the appearance of natural undulation, like a windswept bluff. She planted vetch and rye along the base to bind the soil, seeded clover along the internal trench to draw bees. She placed polished stones at intervals, their surfaces etched with faint geometric lines. She didn't explain the meaning. She didn't need to. If they wanted interpretation, they could build their own. 2 days later, a new sign appeared by the road, not on her property but just adjacent, bolted into a metal frame. It was slicker than the previous ones, professionally designed and printed, with a full-color image of the slope behind her wall digitally altered to show a clear, unbroken vista. Above it, bold lettering read, "Reclaiming the Ridge, a shared vision." There was no name listed, but in the lower left corner sat a familiar logo, Verisight, stylized in matte silver. She stood before it for a long while, saying nothing. Then she walked back to her field, sat on the ground beneath the southernmost bale, and watched the sun drop behind the hill. It took 15 minutes for the light to reach the height of the new wall. When it did, it threw a shadow across the road that landed, almost deliberately, on the sign. She smiled, not because it was clever, but because it was unplanned. A silent alignment, natural and absolute. The next day, her mailbox held a folded flyer, an invitation to a community clarity discussion. There was no mention of her name, but the flyer included a faded outline of her land, labeled Zone of Unresolved Transition. It was being held at the Lakeside Firehouse Neutral Ground. The timing wasn't random. She didn't go, but she sent someone who did. An old acquaintance named Edwin, who once worked in architectural compliance and now lived quietly in a cottage 2 towns over, agreed to attend as an observer. He sat in the back, didn't speak, didn't record. He took notes by hand and wrote down phrases exactly as they were said. That night he brought the list to Willow. Optical uniformity. Shared landscape morality. Proactive adjacency curation. Resistant aesthetic non-cooperation. Willow read each phrase aloud once. Then she lit a match, burned the page, and walked out to her field. The wind was stronger than usual that night, and the wall stood taller than ever. The first real crack in Willow's resolve didn't come from outside, but from within. Not from doubt, but from sheer, grinding exhaustion. It had been almost 6 weeks since the first sign had appeared, and since then the rhythm of her days had been warped by a kind of constant low-level readiness. She couldn't relax. She couldn't forget. Even when things were quiet, when the trucks didn't drive past, when no new markers showed up, the stillness itself had the quality of a setup. Her body had adjusted to a new baseline. Half alert, always checking, always evaluating. At night, she lay in bed and waited for sounds that might never come, memorizing every creak in her trailer, every gust that shook the tin walls. She wasn't afraid, not in the way people think of fear. It was more like a bone-deep recognition that nothing around her could be taken at face value anymore. Every gesture had a motive. Every silence was loaded. So when the letter arrived, printed on glossy cardstock and folded neatly in thirds, she barely registered it as a shift. It was addressed not to her name, but to the occupant of parcel C17A, and it came from a group calling itself the Local Civic Integrity Guild. She had never heard of them. No one had. The letter was formatted like a newsletter, complete with sections titled Upcoming Beautification Events and Open Sightline Saturdays, and nestled between them was a full-color map showing her property rendered in pale red, marked as Under. Visual Pressure Review. The tone of the piece was celebratory, congratulatory even, as though her resistance had somehow qualified her for attention, and attention was the highest form of civic acknowledgement. Willow didn't react. She didn't throw the letter out. She scanned it, logged it, then pinned it to the interior of her trailer next to all the others. The wall above her kitchen table now looked like the evidence board of someone hunting a ghost, and in a way, she was. What she was fighting wasn't a person or even a formal body. It was something looser, more fluid. A culture, a doctrine, a slowly expanding pressure that didn't need legal authority because it functioned through social osmosis. and it was learning, adapting. Every time she adjusted, they pivoted. That weekend, her field was entered again. She didn't catch them in the act. They came between camera sweeps, moving low and fast, cutting through the far eastern corner just long enough to leave behind something crude but unmistakable. A collection of small yard signs, pushed barely an inch into the dirt, each one bearing the same message in different fonts. Some were elegant and cursive, others blocky and utilitarian, but all said the same thing. This land is ready for clarity. There were 26 of them in total, arranged in a long arc at the base of the hay wall, facing the road like a row of smiling volunteers. She stood and looked at them for a long time before removing them, one by one, without expression. She placed each in a pile and burned them all in a rusted metal drum she kept near the shed. 2 days later, she found her gate chain cut. Not entirely, not severed, but bent, as if someone had taken bolt cutters to it and stopped just short. It hung loose, the padlock still closed, but the links visibly deformed, dangling at an unnatural angle that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't entry. It was warning. A message not meant to destroy, but to remind. She called Rita immediately. By then, their communication had become a pattern. Clipped, purposeful, dense with mutual understanding. Rita's voice was tight with frustration, but not surprise. "This is no longer about civic pressure," she said. "It's graduated into coercion. It's time to escalate." Rita filed formal complaints with the Sheriff's Department, the County Commissioner, the State Environmental Board, and the Office of Rural Zoning Oversight. Not because she expected immediate action from any of them, but because the paper trail mattered now. Every unanswered letter, every ignored report, would become ammunition later. Willow supplemented it with photos, logs, sworn statements, and, after some hesitation, testimony from a neighbor named Loretta, who had quietly admitted that Karen had approached her weeks earlier with an offer of landscaping assistance in exchange for a signature on a visibility consensus form. Loretta hadn't signed, but she hadn't come forward either, until now. The next day, Willow's name was mentioned in an email chain that was leaked to her by an anonymous source. It wasn't malicious on the surface, just part of an internal planning document sent by the Civic Guild, outlining their next 3-month campaign. In a section titled Opportunities for Improvement, her parcel was referenced twice. Once as aesthetic impediment with medium resistance, and once as a case study in non-participatory landscape culture. She read it aloud, once, then again, then filed it. Not with anger, with clarity. She didn't react publicly, she didn't post online, she didn't argue. Instead, she made the next move. She contacted a regional soil scientist and requested an independent environmental survey of her slope. The justification was erosion study, a valid concern given the topography. But her real reason was deeper. If they wanted to push legitimacy through design language, she would respond with data. Soil content, vegetation index, pollinator activity. She wanted graphs and signatures, testable numbers no committee could counter with adjectives. The scientist, a soft-spoken man named Dean, arrived a week later with equipment and a clipboard and spent 3 days taking core samples and measuring groundwater seepage. He said little, worked carefully, and at the end gave her a folder containing the basics. "Your hay structure is effective," he said plainly. "Stabilizing runoff, improving root retention, increasing insect presence. It's working." She thanked him, paid him, and sent copies of the report to every agency Rita had contacted. Then she sent one to the Civic Guild, stapled to a note that said only, "Compliance, in case you forgot the definition." The backlash came within 48 hours. First, a second round of signs, this time laminated, zip-tied to her fence posts, citing environmental dissonance under review. Then came the truck, Not a utility vehicle, not an official fleet car. Just an unmarked white pickup, parked for 4 hours across the road from her gate, engine idling. No one got out. No one took pictures. It sat there as if keeping watch, or reminding her she was being watched. She didn't call the police. She logged the time, the plates, the make, and the color. That night, the backup power to her trailer went out. Someone had flipped the external disconnect, the switch hidden behind the trellis she'd built to hold wild peas. It was a small act, quiet. But its precision rattled her. The following morning, she installed perimeter alarms. The motion sensors were infrared, the alerts silent. She connected them to a battery-powered relay board and ran the output through an old mobile screen that displayed nothing but a single color-coded bar. Green when undisturbed, red when tripped. She mounted it above her kitchen sink. That same afternoon, the bar flickered red 3 times in under 10 minutes. She went out, quietly, circled the outer edge. No footprints, no signs of entry. Just one small detail, easy to miss. A tiny pile of chalk dust ground into the gravel near her gate. It wasn't a message, it was a mark. She stared at it for a long time. Then she got her rake and swept it clean. And for the first time since this had started, she didn't just feel like someone resisting. She felt like someone preparing for a siege. It was just after 3 in the morning when the alarm bar blinked twice and went solid red. There had been no wind that night, no storm system in the forecast, and Willow had already walked the perimeter once before bed. The silence in the trailer was so complete that the soft electronic hum from the sensor felt like a scream. She didn't turn on any lights. She moved slowly, boots already by the door, jacket waiting on the hook. She stepped outside with the practiced ease of someone who no longer needed adrenaline to function in the dark. The moon was low but bright, silvering the tops of the hay wall and casting long shadows down the slope. She didn't grab a weapon. She didn't need one. If someone had come to tear something down, they weren't going to be hiding behind trees. They would want her to see them. And that's exactly what they'd planned for. At the far edge of the property, where her field met the ditch and the old road curved out of sight, something was flickering. Not flame, not yet, but movement. As she got closer, the shapes resolved into 6 identical signs hammered into the ground in a half circle, forming a kind of semicircular stage aimed directly at her installation. Each one bore the same phrase, reintegrate or relocate. The font was clean, bold, impossible to misread. Behind them, standing in total silence, were 3 figures dressed in dark jackets, reflective bands at the wrists. One of them held a pole. Not a weapon, just another sign, this one facing away. The moment Willow stepped into the clearing, the person holding it turned it slowly to face her. It said, "Final consideration." Willow didn't speak. She didn't ask who they were or what they wanted. She stood still and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4 long breaths. Then she took a step forward, onto her own land, and pointed back at them, not accusingly, but like a line being drawn in the air. "You've crossed the limit," she said calmly, "and I'm going to bury you in it." The figures didn't move. They didn't respond. After a moment, they turned in sync and walked away into the trees, vanishing like they'd rehearsed the exit. By the time she reached the signs, the stakes were still warm. She pulled them out and piled them near the fire barrel but didn't burn them. Not yet. At 8 that morning, she walked into the County Board of Records and submitted a formal request for property protection under the Rural Harassment Prevention Statute, a rarely used clause buried in zoning law that allowed for temporary intervention when a private landowner could demonstrate an organized pattern of extrajudicial interference. It wasn't something they were used to handling. The woman at the counter called over a supervisor. The supervisor called someone from the legal desk. Rita was already on her way with documentation in hand, everything already compiled. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Willow never raised her voice. She never said the word threat. She didn't have to. The weight of the paper did the talking. Field maps, camera footage, survey data, copies of every flyer, every sign, every action. A pattern was now undeniable. By noon, the county sheriff was on her property. He stood at the base of the hay wall, stared at the landscape for a full minute, then turned to her and said, "You're not making this up." She nodded once and handed him the photos from that morning. He looked through them silently, then made a call. Within an hour, 2 deputies were sweeping the perimeter with her, taking notes, logging the pole holes where the signs had stood, photographing tire impressions that led nowhere. "They're coming in by foot from the green zone," one of the deputies said. "Too smart to leave tracks on the road." The next day, Willow received a notice from the Preservation Board. Her application had passed preliminary review. The hay wall, due to its documented environmental benefit and cultural echoing of historic agricultural form, was eligible for protective designation under the Adaptive Rural Form Act. It wasn't ironclad, but it was a declaration of legitimacy. She now had standing, and standing changed everything. The following week, a public review hearing was scheduled. The room was small, windowless, and badly lit, a converted meeting space in the annex behind the Pinefield Administrative Center. It had 1 folding table, 12 chairs, and a community liaison officer who clearly wished she were elsewhere. Karen arrived early. She wore a slate-gray jacket and carried a folder of documents so thick it required both hands. She smiled at Willow like someone preparing to deliver a eulogy. When called to speak, Karen stood and launched into a precise, rehearsed monologue about the importance of communal coherence in rural adjacent areas. Her voice full of carefully measured concern, never once naming Willow, but describing a challenging topographical presence on parcel C-17A that had become the symbolic center of resistance to cooperative aesthetics. She presented maps, digital renderings, statistical projections. She referenced community optical fatigue. When it was Willow's turn, she didn't bring charts. She didn't even bring notes. She simply stood, held up the original image of her field taken 6 months earlier, and said, "This is what the land looked like before I touched it. You can't pretend to miss what you never cared about until it blocked your view." Then she held up the latest soil report and said, "This isn't a sculpture. It's a system. It breathes. It protects. It exists because I built it. And I'm not going to apologize for giving the land its own face." The room was silent. The liaison read the file, asked 2 clarifying questions, then declared that the parcel had fulfilled all requirements for preservation protection pending final processing. Karen opened her mouth to object but was told to submit any rebuttals in writing. It was over before it started. But the real ending came later. 3 nights after the hearing, Willow was awake late, sitting by the fire barrel. The stars were clear, the wind soft. She heard the truck before she saw it, the same white pickup that had parked near her gate. It stopped at the same distance, engine running. This time, someone got out. A man in his 60s, lean, in a dark utility coat. He didn't approach, he just stood by the edge of the field for a full minute, looking at the wall. Then he turned, looked at her, and nodded once. Not with approval, not even acknowledgement, just recognition. Then he got back in and drove away. She never saw the truck again. The signs stopped appearing. The survey teams disappeared. Karen moved 6 months later, and the wall stayed up. By the time the spring rains came, the hay wall had changed. Not in structure. It still stood 12 feet high, anchored deep into the slope and weathered to a warm golden hue, but in presence. It no longer felt like a boundary. It had become part of the landscape's rhythm, absorbing sunlight, holding warmth, guiding runoff gently into the trench below. Wild grasses had taken root at its base, pushing up through the gravel like cautious witnesses, and the clover she'd seeded months ago now covered the inner ring in a soft carpet that hummed with bees. Willow watched the change unfold with a quiet satisfaction that didn't need celebration. The land had accepted the wall, and that was enough. The committee paperwork came through in late March, stamped and notarized, with a single sentence printed at the bottom of the final page. Installation now recognized as a functional rural hybrid structure under adaptive protection. Rita framed the document for her, unprompted, and presented it like a certificate of honor. Willow didn't hang it. She slid it into the drawer next to her land deed, a private record of something earned without applause. In the months that followed, the strange silence that settled around her property never felt ominous. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a storm has spent itself, the atmosphere too tired for new tension. The trucks no longer circled. The signs didn't reappear. Even the town's seasonal flyers stopped mentioning viewshed alignment or optical zoning integrity. Verisite's logo quietly disappeared from the trailheads, and their proposed greenway plan stalled indefinitely due to lack of aligned community interest. Karen's Civic Guild disbanded after a slow, awkward unraveling. No scandal, no public embarrassment, just dwindling attendance and the slow erosion of authority no one had asked for in the first place. People simply stopped responding. The story she had tried to build had no audience left. Karen herself moved by summer, the sale of her property announced in a brief line of the community bulletin. She left behind nothing but a few ornamental shrubs and an empty storage unit, its door padlocked and tagged by the fire district for removal. Willow didn't attend the farewell. She didn't watch the moving truck. She heard it rumble away just after noon on a Tuesday, and by the time she stepped out onto her porch, only the dust remained. That afternoon, a teenage boy from the next parcel over brought her a mason jar of honey as thanks for the bees. He didn't say much, just handed it to her, said, "My mom said you'd probably know what to do with this," and left. She stood there holding it for a while, surprised by the sweetness of the gesture, then placed it on her windowsill where it caught the light. The trail cameras came down in early April. She removed them one by one, wiping off the dust and packing them away in a weatherproof case she stored under the trailer. The alarms followed. She left the signs, though, not the warnings but the boundary markers, each now painted with a different shade of clay that matched the terrain. They no longer read, "No trespassing." They simply said, "Edge." Just that. Nothing more. Her days returned to a rhythm she hadn't realized she missed. Raking, reseeding, tending the outer edges of the field where the ryegrass now curved into tidy bands. She rebuilt the bench by the upper slope, using old boards she'd once thought too warped to salvage, and angled it toward the wall, not to admire it, but to keep it in sight like a companion. Some evenings she sat there with tea and didn't think about anything. Other nights she brought out a sketch pad, not to plan, but to observe. She had started drawing again, lines and shapes she didn't intend to build, forms that moved across the paper like echoes of something already half-remembered. By midsummer, the field had become something unspoken in the area. People didn't bring it up directly, but word had spread. A few neighbors began experimenting with their own projects. Low-stacked stone mounds, swales planted with native seed, even a crude spiral made of driftwood and sun-bleached bone. No one asked permission. No one explained, and no one tore them down. Something had shifted, subtly but definitively. The land had stopped being a backdrop. It had started being a canvas. One morning, she received a letter from the State Conservation Office. It was informal, just a single page, thanking her for her contribution to passive erosion control efforts and requesting permission to feature her installation in a study on aesthetic, functional land use hybrids. She smiled at the phrasing. It was too stiff, too technical, but she agreed. She didn't need her name in a report. She just wanted the wall to speak in a language louder than permits and clearer than bylaws. Late one afternoon, as she was trimming back the vetch near the western edge, She looked up to find a stranger standing just beyond her fence. A woman in her 40s, hands in her pockets, not smiling, not intruding, just standing there, looking. Willow nodded once. The woman nodded back. Then she turned and left. That was enough. Not everyone came to confront. Some came to understand. The land no longer needed defending. It had defended itself, and now it waited, for rain, for root, for whatever came next.